Hi, I'm Don. Welcome to my channel. I'm an affiliate painter for Red Grass Games and also the head mecha and sci-fi painter for Vallejos Colors. I write painting articles for Fine Scale Modular Magazine. I also write articles for Fantasy Figures International Magazine. Lastly, if you're into Gunpla, do use my discount code for usagundamstore.com. Links down below. Today we paint this Darkgods model. Basically, we'll do sketching with an airbrush. Also, the second part of the video is a bit of comparison with this T1 Grapho airbrush, Grapho T1 airbrush, and my Infinity CR+. We used both the Grapho and the Infinity in this model, and I'll share my thoughts on the Grapho later in the video. First, we used the Infinity CR+. I have a 0.15 needle here, and I thin my paints around 3 parts paint and 1 part thinning sauce. Oh, and at 20-ish PSI. I've been using the Infinity CR Plus for almost 2 years now. I got it from Tetsujin, Singapore, almost a couple of years ago, around Feb 2019, I'm not sure. Anyways, it's a sponsored model, it's a sponsored airbrush, so that's tricky when comparing something like the Grapho, which I bought. The Infinity CR Plus by Harder Steenbeck is the top-of-the-line airbrush from the German company. So it's like, naturally it's the best amongst their range, but I'll compare it later with the Grapho. Now let's use my Grapho T1 airbrush. I quickly tested some thinning ratios behind camera or off camera. I used my thinning sauce, a bit of flow improver mixture, and no thinning. After a few testing, I opted with no thinning. Always remember that too much thinning will make spider webs or will make the paint run all over the place, and no thinning sometimes will produce like clogging and or very like sandy texture to your finish. I opted not to use even a drop of flow improver because if you see, whenever I reload paint, I just put like a couple of drops of paint or even a drop of paint, so there's no like room for adding a bit more flow improver or a thinning sauce because it will make the paints like act differently. So I opted with no thinning whatsoever. I'm only using mecha paints here and Vallejo Game Air. I'm not sure if I use Model Air. Basically use air paints. Vallejo air paints are formulated or designed to work straight from the bottle, but there's a caveat to that. So basically, if you use air paints, personally I still thin my air paints with my thinning sauce, because if you paint like farther away from the model, you need flow improver definitely and a bit of thinning because it will dry mid-air. So if the paint dries mid-air because of the distance from the model and the airbrush, you will have a sandy texture, which is very like sandy. As far as I know, a sandy finish or a sandy texture is undesirable. So let's go back to the distance between the model and the airbrush. As you can see, I use the Grapho nearer the model because I'm detail painting or adding highlights to the model, sketching with the airbrush. So since it's nearer the model, I don't really need to thin. I don't even need flow improver. So there's no drying in mid-air and there's no tip drying because we're just using a bit of paint. We're not really painting the whole day or painting an hour with all these colors. We're just painting highlights and little amounts of paint. Also, it's very, very important to note that I don't do 10 PSI stuff. That's old school stuff. Although I'm old school and old, but I don't do that. I lower my PSI. The lowest would be 15 PSI. But surprisingly, for this job, for the detail painting with the Grapho, without thinning, I actually jacked up the PSI to around 25-ish. I like the process or the method because the unthinned paint, air paints that is, are not prone to spider webs, and because it's not very thin, it's actually thick. So by jacking up the PSI, the pressure, I was able to control the paint without spider webs without clogging because of the high pressure. So it's kind of weird and maybe unorthodox, but it worked for me. I'm totally not saying that this is the absolute way to do detail painting with the Grapho airbrush without thinning, high pressure, and all that stuff, because this might all change if I do a bit more experiment with it and paint more models. But as of now, for this video, this is kind of working for me. So that's it for the testing of the Grapho. It's really nice. You could actually use it to paint the base colors and definitely do some detail painting and touch-ups. So do I recommend the Grapho T1 airbrush by Harder and Steenbeck? Now it's tip time. Let's answer that question. So do I recommend getting the Grapho T1 airbrush? Most definitely, yes. It is very important to note that I bought my Grapho airbrush, and also it's a new toy, and new toys tend to be favored. The CR Plus is like the highest end of airbrush from Harder and Steenbeck, so naturally it's the best. They produced it and manufactured it to be their best airbrush. The CR Plus has the most sensitive controls in all the airbrushes that I've used through the years. So that sensitivity means more control, more airflow control, and more paint flow control. And too much controls might be hard or difficult for some people. Now that is why I highly recommend the Grapho for detail painting, post shading, and highlighting. The Grapho felt like a single action, which is great because you pull a bit for air and pull farther for paint. It's a single stroke of like pulling, and you can control the paint with precision easier than the Infinity. The Infinity has great sensitive controls. If you push down the trigger, that will control the airflow, and then you pull the trigger and that will control the paint flow. So that's double action, the classic double action, which is pushing down for air and pulling for paint. Detailing with the Grapho is simpler in my opinion in comparison to the Infinity, because you simply pull for air and pull farther for paint. That simpler mechanism makes the painter more focused on the actual detail painting, post shading, or highlighting rather than being mindful of the sensitive controls of the airflow and the paint flow. So if you have an all-rounder, cheaper airbrush like for painting the base colors, the primers and varnishes and all that, I highly recommend you get the Grapho for detailing. Of course, if you have the money, get both, but for me, I'll be getting the Grapho first before I get the Infinity. That's it, we're done. I hope you liked the video. Do like, comment, subscribe, and consider joining the channel so that you'll be part of our Discord community. Saludos! I am Don. Welcome to my channel.